Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about several great value vintage watches on the market this month, which really offer everything from military past to a real diving history, as well as some of the most elegant dress watches really ever produced, from prices ranging from a couple of £100 to £5,000 in the case of the dive watch I'd like to talk about. But certainly all have their place and all offer a brilliant amount for the amount of money you're paying and have a great deal of history behind them. However, before I begin this video, I would like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is my group on Snups, the social media platform for sharing pictures of your collections and interests, and where you can discuss matters of horology with myself and indeed other enthusiasts, and I'll do my utmost to reply personally to any questions or video requests you happen to give me. Therefore, I would strongly encourage you to follow the link down below and download the app, which is available for iOS or Android, depending on what you're using to be most convenient, and join the great many other individuals who are already using these additional features and really getting the most out of this channel. Now, the first watches I'd like to talk about are indeed from the Cabot Watch Company, or CWC. And this is a company which became very famous for producing watches for the British Armed Forces. Notably, their dive watches replaced the Rolex Mil Sub as the dive watch of choice for the Special Forces in the Navy, which is something which very few companies can say, and in truth, those watches, the mechanical versions of those watches, are now extremely rare. But this is a very different watch. These are their mechanical pilot's watches, though they were issued to both pilots in the RAF as well as simple armed force members in the late 1970s. And these feature really all the characteristics of a military watch that you would expect, and allow you the opportunity to buy something which normally you wouldn't be able to buy, or if, at least at the time, would be unavailable to the public, now in reasonable condition in most cases, with a very easily serviced and reliable movement. And these are smaller watches, as they come in at about 35mm or about 37mm with the crown. But then all of these military issue watches were always very small as a result of being required to fit on anyone's wrist, and so as a result larger watches weren't really an option. And these watches feature an ETA 2750, which is really a manually wound 17 jewel movement, which also features hacking, which is something you won't normally see on watches of that era. Especially at that price, for the simple reason that in the army they had to have watches they could synchronise to the second, which is perfectly reasonable. And of course that arrow on the dial and then as well on the case back defines the fact that these are military issue. And I know that versions with 6BB on them refer to the RAF, though the references do tell you a great deal about what these watches were intended to be for. And the more eagle-eyed viewers will have noticed the T for tritium on the dial. And that means these watches did have a radioactive compound of tritium on the dial, though this is harmless to individuals, unlike radium. It likely won't glow anymore as a result of the half-life of it being about 25 years. And the design of these dials is really fantastic and is reminiscent of IWC pilots' watches in its military style, with the numerals going around the dial and then that very legible triangle at 12 o'clock, giving this watch an unmistakable military vibe and appearance, which you really can't get otherwise, and I must say these are very elegant and in many ways quite beautiful watches. The cases are brushed and are stainless steel with fixed lug bars, which means that you have to use a pass-through strap. You can't use conventional two-piece ones, but then for a military watch which is designed to go on a NATO strap, I feel putting it on anything else would simply be inappropriate. And I feel the crowning piece of these watches are the crystals, which are these beautiful domed acrylic-style crystals, which can be easily polished and are very shock-resistant. Hence, they were perfect for use by the armed forces. And I think they add a vintage air to these watches. And for the price that these are available for, between £200 and £500, usually close to the £200 mark, but for exceptional examples, maybe £500 would be the top end. I think they really are giving an enormous amount, with a Swiss movement and a real military history to these timepieces. Now, the second watches I'd like to talk about are from Eterna. And Eterna are a brand which I find somewhat jarring today, because their presence is so much smaller than it was back in their heyday, in really the 50s and 60s, and you could even consider the 40s as their era as well. Because they produced some of the most impressive changes to the watch world and had a really immense influence. Because Eterna were responsible for the brand ETA, and of course ETA now produce the vast majority of the world's Swiss movements, which is a remarkable feat on its own. But Eterna also pioneered the use of ball bearings on the rotors, and specifically their Eternamatic line has become a really brilliant option for people looking for automatic vintage dress watches, with a fantastic history in terms of movements, and also very attractive styling. And the movements you'll most likely find in these watches are the caliber 1422, and this is a movement which really has become quite legendary as far as a workhorse movement in the Eterna range. And of course, let's not forget the Eterna range and the movements they produced and used became the ETA line, for example in the case of the 1466, which became the ETA 2892 ultimately, which does show the history this brand has. And the watches they make are really quite remarkable because they come in a variety of different case shapes and materials. You see gold ones at a remarkably good price, because these were produced over such a vast number of years, from really the late 50s through the 70s. So certainly one can find a lot of Eternamatic models which are really fantastic in terms of the value they offer, and in terms of the quality of the watches themselves. And of course, because these were very often dress watches, you can find, really, for around £300, one with a dial which is almost untouched by age, and still has the original markings, because they weren't high enough value watches to warrant having replaced or repolished and readorned dials, which is something which normally destroys the value of certain vintage watches. And of course, one can't forget the way Eterna made their name, really, in the major world of the watch industry. Because, of course, in 1948, Eterna introduced the Eternamatic range, and it's unlikely that one can find one in this budget from that era. But certainly the history of this is very well placed, because, of course, the logo of the brand itself is derived from the arrangement of 5 ball bearings on the rotor, which enable the friction here to be reduced enormously, and thus allow the rotor to move more freely and wind the mainspring more efficiently. And this also increased service intervals, which again was an area which Eterna innovated in and was so proud of this. They produced a logo based on this design, which I think adds a certain history to this and really does show Eterna's influence and impact on the watch industry as a whole. And so the pricing for these watches in steel, for example, with these rather beautifully adorned dials with applied indices, beautifully polished hands and the wonderful applied logo, as well as domed dials with very attractive sunburst effects, you can really acquire for between £250 and £600, which is quite remarkable compared to modern-day alternatives of this quality. And this doesn't include the fact that these watches are also available in 9-carat or 18-carat gold, and that's solid gold, not plating, for between £700 and about £1,400, which is remarkable, bearing in mind that a solid gold watch from any other manufacturer, in terms of a manufacturer of this reputation, would set you back over twice as much, which is an incredible thing to say, bearing in mind the value and the history of Eterna. The third watch in this video is a really interesting piece, and one which I feel is very much underrated. And this is the Tissot Seastar Navigator, and a watch from the 1970s, which was designed to be a sort of a chronograph, a sports chronograph with a tonneau style of case, which in my eyes is one of the best looking watches made by the brand. And this is a chronograph powered by the Veljoux 7734, which is a manually wound chronograph movement which is very easily serviced and is very common in chronographs of that era. And these watches come with a bicompax layout to the dial, with running seconds, a 30-minute chronograph, and the date. And this allows the watch to be very clear and legible on the dial with these baton-style hands and these dots of luminescent tritium from the era. And of course the tritium will have expired by this point and therefore won't glow anymore, but certainly it still adds a really wonderful air to the dial. Additionally, the bezel features a tachymeter, though on most versions this is rubbed off, and these versions feature a great many different colours of dials, everything from blacks to whites to blues, which can be extremely appealing to the buyer. And the design of these watches is typically 1970s and certainly is an acquired taste. But for those who do like the design of this with its large barrel or tonneau style of case, which at 40mm was large for the time rather, but now actually fits extremely well on most wrists, with a smaller dial which does give the watch a very vintage sort of flair, but certainly the pushers and the crown and the general aesthetic of the watch does come across as modern in terms of its sizing. And of course these watches do feature a nice brushed effect as well, which avoids any sort of danger of the watch appearing too garish, because these watches do appear to be no-nonsense sports chronographs, and are very well made for that purpose. And their movements are not the most decorated things in the world. In fact, most of the bridges and plates are simply left bare. But nonetheless, these movements are very easily serviced and are generally extremely reliable, which is something you really want when buying a budget vintage watch. You don't want something that will cost a fortune for servicing. And of course, with these watches, all of these Seastar Navigators featured stainless steel cases, which is an additional weight off one's mind, because often there is the concern, especially with poorly written listings for watches, whether or not the case will be stainless steel or if it will in fact be a base metal that's then plated. But certainly with these watches, they really were quality products and were in fact entirely stainless steel, which is a great thing to see, where a lot of brands did cut corners in that era to try and maximise profit, whereas now, of course, we observe stainless steel as being one of the most crucial building blocks, I suppose, of a robust watch. Then that wasn't the case. So the peace of mind this offers is brilliant. And the colouring of these watches is also superb, from the white dial models with the oranges and reds, as well as blacks, to the blue dial models with lots of bright sections on the sub-dials, and then also the black models with silver sections really do give each watch a unique flair, which is something you don't normally see in a watch, especially at this budget, with a really reliable and high-quality movement. And this does make these watches extremely attractive to everyone, from the amateur watch enthusiast to a hardcore collector. And so with a price of between £400 and £800, these really do offer a lot to any sort of collector, and are watches that you can really enjoy on a daily basis without worrying too much about their surface, because of course they are stainless steel, as I've said, and feature a reliable, robust and easily serviced movement, making these watches a brilliant option for someone who wants to get into the vintage chronograph world, but doesn't want to spend the earth. The penultimate watch in this video is a watch which I think many collectors have a real affinity for, and has been doing very well in terms of sales prices this month, and even for the last few months, but has reached a point where actually it's offering incredible value really to a collector, if one's willing to spend between £2,000 and £3,000 or a little bit less for the steel version. And this is the Rolex 1601, which is to say probably the most classic of DateJusts, produced from the early 1960s through to the 1980s. And it's a watch which, despite its very long production life, changed remarkably little during this time, and really did become an iconic timepiece in terms of Rolex DateJust and a sporting dress watch. And this is a watch which of course features two of Rolex's most famous mechanisms, or at least designs. The DateJust concept of having an automatically changing date behind that Cyclops window, which is courtesy of the Rolex 1570 movement inside, which is an in-house Rolex movement, and certainly does show the quality that went into these flagship products of their era. And of course this is also an oyster case, so you have that water resistance, though I would encourage anyone who's planning to take this watch anywhere near water to have it tested by a watchmaker first, because the seals on a watch of this age will be shot, and so as a result it's really worthwhile to have those replaced, or at least have the watch tested to be entirely sure the watch can in fact hold its own against water and humidity. But nonetheless, as far as a concept to have with that iconic style of case, this watch really does have it all. And of course that high plexiglass crystal with the dome on the Cyclops window really does give a charm of its own to this watch, which matches that fluted bezel very, very well. And the interesting thing about this watch is that now, in the current market, these watches are competing directly with the Tudor Prince or the Oyster Princes. And these are watches which were produced by the Rolex group, by the Hans Wilsdorf group, but did in fact feature ETA movements rather than the in-house Rolex ones, and didn't quite feature the detail and care that the Rolexes did as the flagship line. And so it's impressive to see that now that actually Tudor's return to the market has boosted the price of their watches to such a point where they're actually competing almost perfectly with these DateJusts. And that makes these DateJusts really remarkable value, because they do have such a high quality of production, and they are easily serviced by most watchmakers, which is an added benefit, though of course Rolex can be difficult when it comes to servicing older watches. They certainly are movements which are very commonplace, and parts can be found rather easily. And at 36mm with one of the most classic case designs, this watch wears in a truly traditional way. It doesn't wear particularly small, but nonetheless is very comfortable on the wrist, and will fit really the vast majority of wrists, and frankly there are very, very few people who have wrists that are the wrong size for a 36mm DateJust. And granted, it doesn't have quite the presence of a modern DateJust in terms of its proportions, but in many ways it's more of an elegant piece, and in most respects I would say this is a piece which may well suit more wrists than the current alternative. And for this price of between £2,000 and £3,000, you can get hold of either the 1601, which features the very soft and delicate fluted bezel in either yellow gold or white gold, and again you also have a matching bracelet, or you can get the 1603, which is the full steel version with a machined bezel, which can appeal to certain people who prefer a more rugged aesthetic to their watch, and who want something a bit different, and something which is more uncommon to see than the white gold version. And so as a result, there really is a version for everyone, depending on what you particularly find appealing in a Rolex. But one thing to bear in mind with these watches, as the only downside really, is the fact that the bracelets will be rather rickety, and they are simply folded over links rather than solid links as we see today. Of course, the upshot is that you can get a really brilliant watch with a fantastic movement, a great selection of different dials and hands, as well as a brilliant design and a timeless classic, for a remarkably reasonable price which is comparable to some of the vintage remakes that one often sees on the market. Now, the final watch in this video reaches a price range which I wouldn't normally talk about in these videos, because this watch comes in at between about £3,500 and £5,000. And this does seem like a very large amount of money, but the reason why I talk about this watch is because recently these watches have done remarkably well in terms of being very, very well priced, considering the history they have by comparison to things like a Rolex Double Red Sea Dweller. And the Rolex Sea Dwellers now cost upwards of £20,000 in the case of the 1665s, which are the models which are direct references to this watch. And this is the 1970 to 1979 production of Omega, which is the Seamaster 600, or the PloProf. And this watch was designed specifically with the help of Jacques Cousteau, the famous marine explorer, and Comex, because Comex were in need of a watch which could resist helium ingress, because their watches had been exploding as a result of helium entering the watch, and then during decompression bursting the crystal off the watch. And so as a result, both Rolex and Omega set about producing watches for this specification, and this was Omega's answer. And I've produced an entire video about this, so I won't go into the history too much. But these watches were built around the concept of a watch which was as water resistant as it could be. And whilst Rolex took the approach of producing a watch with a helium escape valve, Omega simply produced a watch which was airtight. Because most watches aren't airtight, they're watertight, but they're not airtight. And this watch ended up with its monoblock case with no opening case back, so you had to drop the movement in through the front. With this 55mm stainless steel case, it ended up being more airtight than the Apollo space capsule, which is an incredible feat for a mere watch brand, and as a result this has, in my eyes, become one of the most influential dive watches of the history of this type of watch. And these watches were designed specifically to be legible and useful for a diver, hence that button on the case to release the bezel, to be able to turn it, which added further security than having a simple bidirectional bezel, as was the case then, before the introduction of the unidirectional bezel. And these watches were rated at a depth rating of, or rather for a depth rating of 600 metres, but were tested to 1370, which was the point at which the crystal had deformed so much it touched the hands and stopped the watch. But if the crystal hadn't deformed, then this watch would be more water resistant than that, which was quite remarkable considering the water resistances available from watches of the era. And another beauty of these watches is the way that pressure is managed in these watches. Because whereas other watches went for the approach of simply making the watch as resilient as possible and thickening the surface of the watch, Omega, despite making this watch 55mm for the sake of being able to be used with gloves and to have an ease of legibility, also had to be this size simply to incorporate a technology which, in my eyes, is extremely clever. And this is by putting a gasket between the crystal, and that goes around the edge of the dial, by the way, and the movement, which presses against the case back, which of course is a single piece. The pressure applied from the front of the watch can be transferred directly to the case back, which of course has the same pressure applied to it, creating a certain equilibrium. And this does mean that then the crystal only has to deform inwards, but the seals and the crush depth, per se, of the watch is increased enormously. And this is the same technique used on the modern Rolex Deep Sea, but only 40 years prior, which I think is truly remarkable. And if this watch had a metal spacer rather than this rubber gasket, the watch may have been even more water resistant than we know it is to this specification. And as a result, this makes this watch, in my eyes, an unbelievable piece of history and a wonderful piece to own for a lucky collector. Because in truth, these watches are built around the idea of being the best dive watches in the world and for a real purpose. And so as a result, I feel the idea of being able to get hold of the top of the range Omega for a price of £3,500 to £5,000 is quite remarkable, because it'll enable the buyer to have truly the pinnacle of the dive watch technology of that era at a remarkably reasonable price with a serviceable movement, with the only downside being the sheer size of the watch, which I think a true enthusiast can look past, making this watch a piece which I think is not something to be missed if you're interested in vintage dive watches. Anyway, I'll conclude this video here, but please do leave your comments down below as to what you think of spending this sort of money on a PloProf in remarkably good condition. So thank you very much for watching, and please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to be able to enjoy more content here in the future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.